Hello and welcome to the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. We have three issues for you today. First of all, the fallout from last night's BBC Scottish Leaders debate. Then we're going to digest the Conservative Manifesto, which was launched yesterday. And then thirdly, just for a little bit of fun, although I'm told there's a lot of academic research on this, will the performance of England and Scotland at the Euros have any bearing on the poll? Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Bernard.
I was reading your piece in the Times today. You've scored all of the leaders out of 10. I think you're mean, by the way. I think you're very, very mean in your scoring. Talk us through how you saw it.
Well, I thought I was really quite generous. I mean, I gave nobody more than 5 out of 10, and I think I gave Douglas Ross 2 out of 10. And even that was, searching for positives for the Conservative leader's performance, I thought, last night, which was atrocious and completely lacking the kind of nimbleness and quickness of thought that you would hope to have from a leading and now really quite experienced politician. As always with these things, I think you can question the format. If you have 5 politicians on the panel and just 60 minutes in which to quiz them, there's not a lot of room for proper exploration of any given topic. When you then have observations and questions from the audience, however welcome or pertinent those may be, you further diminish the opportunity to really get into any kind of policy discussion. And so the whole thing becomes a sort of rigmarole in some ways, I think. I'm not sure that people who pay a lot of attention to politics learnt very much from it, and I'm not sure how many people who don't pay very much attention to politics would have been paying attention to the 60 Minutes broadcast by BBC Scotland last night. But perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps I'm being too harsh on them.
Well, I started groaning quite early on because I thought, I've heard all of these lines before. And I thought, where have I heard them? And I thought, I heard them in the first debate, the STV leaders debate of Monday of last week. And I thought, STV should have just sent all of the clips over to the BBC and said, just run these because this is what they're going to say. Literally, all of the lines which we had in the first debate were trotted out in the second debate. So from that point of view, not a lot that was new at all. I don't think there was any absolutely unambiguously clear winner on the night. I suspect the Labour people will be the Labour people will be happy with Anas Sarwar's performance. With regard to the audience, I did sniff as someone who's chaired these and moderated these over the years. I did sniff a couple of people and I thought they are clearly party political. Now, people who are members of political parties are allowed to go into these audiences, but I thought one or two of the attacks, one in Sarwar, one in Swinney, came from individuals who, can I put it this way, seemed to be briefed before they sat down. But the key thing actually about the audience, I don't know what you felt, I think some of the issues they raised were good. I think some of the audience contributions were genuinely excellent. And the key thing for me is that this is the first time in a very long time where I've seen an audience groan at a First Minister and almost be not prepared to accept the lines of explanation that were given. And from that point of view, an SNP politician being given a pretty difficult time by sections of the audience, well, I haven't seen that in a long number of years.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it was noticeable the way opposition politicians, Alex Cole-Hamilton in particular, was harping on about how there's always an excuse, there's always someone else to blame. The buck never stops at Bute House. And that was something that, as the evening drew on, had more and more, I think, resonance with the audience as well, as you say, that where John Swinney is sort of giving the impression that the Scottish Government's hands are tied. All roads lead back to Westminster has become the sort of SNP mantra in this campaign, a reference to somewhat unfortunate from a Labour point of view comment made by Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, when he was asked about the underperformance of, or the poor performance of the NHS in Wales. He sort of said, well, you've got to consider the overall funding mechanism and all roads lead back to Westminster, which is, there's obviously a degree of truth in that. At the same time, public spending in Scotland is equivalent to around 50% of GDP. That is extremely high, noticeably higher than it is in England. If you strip out volatile oil revenues, in the most recent figures, public spending in Scotland is actually around 55, 56% of onshore GDP, which is a huge sum, comparable with the largest states anywhere in Europe. And yet, do we have comparable levels of outcomes when it comes to the provision of public services? I think that's a difficult case to make. And, there's an increasing exasperation or weariness, I think, that you've sensed amongst the electorate that after 17 years in power, it is time for the SNP to own their own shortcomings, if you like. And the logic of this election, of course, which is a change election now quite clearly, is that after 14 years of Conservative rule at Westminster, their time is up. Well, doesn't the same logic then apply to the SNP as we look forward to the 2026 Holyrood election?
I thought the interesting thing was that John Swinney's line of attack in relation to Anas Sarwar was exactly the same as it was in the STV debate. It did not change. It was predicated on the Institute for Fiscal Studies observation that there's billions of pounds of cuts coming down the line, irrespective of who wins the election, because they're not going to be able to grow their way out of the problems in terms of revenues. We've got these GDP figures today which show that flatlining. But the interesting thing was that Anas Sarwar was ready for it. I didn't think he was ready for it in the STV debate. Read my lips, no austerity. The BBC will be filing that one away. Read my lips, no austerity, because after Rachel Reeves's first budget, if there are any cuts at all, that particular statement would come back to haunt Anas Sarwar. But the interesting thing about John Swinney's attack, using the Institute for Fiscal Studies almost as if the IFS are God, and in some respects, in these matters they are, because their commentaries are very, very dispassionate and the research is completely and utterly thorough. Completely legitimate for John Swinney to raise this. Utterly legitimate. I would merely point out that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have had a number of reports about health spending in Scotland. The IFS have had observations about the way in which the Scottish Government have treated Scottish local authorities who are on the front line of providing public services in Scotland. MSPs don't provide public services, but councillors do and are responsible and accountable for them. So it really is a case that politicians will take the IFS as God when it suits them, and the IFS will also be the devil when it doesn't suit them.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, the SNP do not encourage anyone to look at what the IFS and other disinterested observers have to say about the financial implications and the fiscal realities of life in an independent Scotland in the early years of that nation's existence. Those successive SNP politicians are very happy to cite a study done by the London School of Economics, which shows the damaging impact of Brexit and the increased trade barriers that there are that have resulted as a result of that, and the hit that's had on GDP. They do not like us to point out that the exact same researchers at the LSE had calculated that independence for Scotland would have an impact on trade 2 or 3 times greater than Brexit. So there's always a little bit of this sort of cherry picking from politicians. But you're right. I thought Sarwar's read my lips, no austerity tactic was quite bold. It did suggest that a certain lack of familiarity with George H.W. Bush's remarks at the 1988 Republican convention. Read my lips, no new taxes.
And then he put them up.
And then he put them up because, there was a recession and, this was back in the days when, Republicans in the United States were on nodding terms with fiscal reality, which is no longer the case, obviously. And so he put up taxes, and that was then used to hammer him within the conservative movement, within the Republican movement in the United States in 1992, and played a part, I think, in his defeat by Bill Clinton. Now, that's all quite a long way from Anas Sarwar, obviously, but still. But even, I mean, Swinney, I think, had a reasonable point when he was talking about, look, neither Labour nor the Conservatives are being entirely honest with people about the fiscal challenges in the years ahead. At the same time, in the context of £1 trillion budget, the question of 18 billion here or there isn't actually all that significant. It's the kind of thing that minor changes in economic growth could actually provide the fiscal headroom, the space in which to actually obviate those spending cuts. But of course, we won't know that until we get there.
Just back to the debate, I thought that Douglas Ross was pretty muted and pretty quiet. He almost gave the impression of a man, I better not go on the attack and make myself unpopular because at some point
he's already done the heavy lifting on that.
I'm going to be asked about this decision to stand in the election. And, the astonishing thing really was that it took the presenter, Stephen Jardine, actually to ask the point. I am simply amazed. I am simply amazed that none of the other leaders during one of the exchanges actually managed to work in a couple of lines of attack on his decision to stand in this election. And that might have encouraged the audience to make some observations, or it might have put him on the back foot. The overwhelming feeling from Douglas Ross, I think, will be relief that he actually managed to get through the debate. Alex Cole-Hamilton, he always looks just pleased to be there. And Lorna Slater, I found some of her stuff actually difficult to follow because she didn't talk at 100 miles an hour. She talked at 200 miles an hour. The words all just crashed into one another. And I'm not sure that in some of her points they made sense. But I liked the little sketch that your colleague Magnus Linklater has in the Times today. And he says, with Lorna Slater, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, when she gets angry, she waves her arms around like a demented wind turbine, and her voice gets as shrill as a seagull searching for the nearest chip. I take it Magnus ain't a fan.
No, well, I mean, I think it's fair to say, that Magnus is Highland Perthshire gentry, and there are not many votes for the Green Party in that neck of the woods. But the Greens are quite interesting as well in certain respects. There's clearly a pitch being made there to outflank the SNP from the pro-independence left, and the election of John Swinney as SNP leader, bringing Kate Forbes back into government, does change the nature of the SNP administration a little bit. It does move it somewhat to the right. And again, this is as we've talked about before, the long-running tension between, if you like, Highland nationalism and Central Belt nationalism. And it's the Highlanders who are clearly in the ascendancy just now. And so that does create a degree of space, I think, for the Greens that might not previously have been available. You're right, Alex Cole-Hamilton always just looks happy to be invited to these things. Hope and change are on the way, he says, and so on. And I'm not quite sure where that cavalry is coming from. But, Douglas Ross, again, I agree. I thought his performance was very weak, even when presented with, open goals by, there was a member of the audience who raised the Barnett formula. And Ross lacked the nimbleness and dexterity and quickness of thought and foot to sort of say, well, yes, the Barnett formula is a great thing for Scotland. It means that public spending per capita in Scotland is 12 to 15% higher than it is in England. And so if we have better outcomes from public services, well, we should, because we have more money to spend on them. And that's not necessarily money that is raised in Scotland, But bafflingly, from my point of view, he failed to raise any of this. And he looked like a guy who is hoping for the final whistle to come pretty soon. He already seems like yesterday's man following his announcement that he's going to step down as leader of the Conservative Party at Holyrood, regardless of the election result. Just
wrapping up on the debate, of course, all the broadcasters, I know, because I used to do it myself over the years. You try and hype yourself up to, in a sense, persuade the viewers that this is all more exciting than it really is. And of course, after the debate finished, we had three politicians who were interviewed in the spin room with Fiona Hislop, Craig Hoy, and Jackie Bailey, and then we'd sort of Ross Greer and Willie Rennie later on. And surprise, surprise, they all thought their own leader won. And I thought anybody watching this at home who is genuinely neutral must just yawn at the way in which they simply trot out these very, very tired lines about how well their leader happened to do. At one point, we were told that the atmosphere in the spin room was electric. Unfortunately, the picture from behind showed that there was a lot of journalists standing around, not appearing to be particularly engaged or interested, and wondering what copy they were going to file from this debate. So anyway, they got it out of the way. I thought it looked good. I thought the lighting on the programme was very good. I thought it had a sense of event. So thumbs up to the BBC for at least mounting something which I think was high in ambition, but, did it deliver well? They just all rehearsed their lines. They gave their lines. There's nobody dead. We move on to polling day. And let's move on to the manifestos, Alec. The Tory manifesto, what did you make of it?
Well, not much more than the Conservatives have made of it themselves. One of the striking things, I think, the Conservatives published their manifesto, and then 24 hours later, they're effectively conceding defeat in the election. Grant Shapps is warning that it's a terrible thing for democracy if Labour win a supermajority, 200 seats or whatever. And the Prime Minister is sort of saying, well, the election is a chance to, make sure that Labour don't win too big. That is effectively a concession of defeat, even before the postal ballots have started going out. And to that extent, the Tory manifesto, I thought, had a slightly sort of unreal quality to it. Nobody expects the provisions in it to become government policy. And so it's a laundry list of aspirations. And in that sense, again, it was almost cheeky, I think, of Keir Starmer to say that it reminded him of the 2019 Labour manifesto, which promised the earth free broadband for everybody and so on. A whole list of individually attractive policies and propositions, perhaps, but that collectively simply lack credibility. And those I think that was the overall impression of the Conservative manifesto. Now, as I say, a certain amount of cheek from Starmer to make that specific criticism, having enthusiastically backed the 2019 Labour manifesto himself. But I think the confidence that he shows in being able to make that criticism is further confirmation of the realities underpinning this election campaign, which has already effectively, in some ways, I think, fizzled out, and we've still got 3 weeks to go.
Yeah, I thought it was very instructive yesterday. I was looking at the BBC's one of many reports on the Conservative manifesto yesterday, and the political editor, Chris Mason, simply doorstepped a number of cabinet ministers at the launch. And he stands in front of James Cleverly and says, "Are you going to win with this manifesto?" And there was just that pregnant pause from Cleverly as he thought, what's the line here? If I say, yes, we're going to win, are folk going to start laughing at this, given what the polls say? What do I do? But the fact that there was that very, very pregnant pause, I thought he clearly doesn't think there's any chance of victory. Jeremy Hunt appears to be saying that his constituency could be on a knife edge within 1,500 votes. And, this is all a nightmare for the Conservatives. And therefore, you have to ask, is there anything in that manifesto which is going to change the dial? And I simply don't think that there is. I mean, I suppose the sort of headline figures from it help to buy their punting. Stamp duty, no stamp duty paid in properties up to £425,000. Even if they were to win and introduce that, no chance that would ever be introduced in Scotland by the government here.
Yeah.
Abolition of national insurance for the self-employed.
Well, I mean, okay, I have an interest there, but
let's just tease them out one by one. Abolition of stamp duty up to 425,000. In the absence of a massive house building program where you deal with the central issue of supply, giving people help to buy will only have one consequence. It will drive up further the price of houses in terms of the existing supply. So it means that people who are getting help to buy will probably be overpaying. They'll be further driving up house prices. And in the absence of the central issue, which is supply, it won't actually work. Abolition of national insurance for the self-employed. They, of course, play national insurance at a lower level. Yeah, I can sort of see the benefit of that for self-employed people. But, of course, again, the headline figure, a further 2p cut in national insurance by 2027, on top of the 4p cut in national insurance in 2024. Again, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies have reminded us, the 4p cut in national insurance in 2024 has not been funded. It is predicated on as yet unspecified cuts in public expenditure. And having not funded the first two cuts, which have given them no electoral traction whatsoever, because people, I don't think, are listening any longer, they compound this by effectively ensuring that by 2027, you have a 6p cut in national insurance. How are they going to pay for it? Just magic 12 billion off the welfare bill. Good luck with that, because all of the experience of previous governments who have tried to cut the welfare bill, they might be able to save here and there. 12 billion of welfare cuts? Really? Seriously? Like to see you try. Like to see you find them.
Indeed, I mean, here the Conservatives are sort of caught in a slightly ironic position, because I think there is a decent case for making that if you're going to be cutting personal taxes at all, then national insurance is actually a better way of doing it than income tax, because it's a tax on work. But of course, this is offset by the freezing of tax thresholds, which means that fiscal drag is going to amount to about a 4p increase in the standard rate of income tax by the end of the next Parliament anyway. And it is further offset by the cockamamie notion that pensioners should have a different tax rate from people of working age. That the, which is, I mean, this is something that did used to be the case, and it was actually abolished by George Osborne in 2013, but this notion that pensioners shouldn't start paying income tax until a higher level of earnings than working people, I think is completely indefensible. And again, offsets some of the benefits of your measures elsewhere.
Especially Alec, because there's only, in terms of pensioners, I actually agree with that. Most pensioners still have occupational pensions on top of their state pension. Now, some of these occupational pensions are extremely modest, but I think it's only about, I say only, it's still a very, 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 very high number, about a quarter of pensioners who only rely on the basic state pension. So this idea that for 3/4 of pensioners who have got a state pension and a private pension, they get extra help.
And are the richest pensioners we've ever had.
The richest pensions we've ever had, because the average, I think there's a stat that was out this year, the average pensioner couple who do not have any housing costs, and most won't because they will have paid off their mortgage, in terms of the disposable income, they now have more disposable income in retirement than the average disposable income of a family after housing costs have been taken into account. There's a massive issue of intergenerational fairness here. The Conservatives simply will never actually address it because their core vote is the grey vote.
Yeah, and, as you say, this is sort of exacerbated when, an awful lot of things come back to housing, particularly in the south of England, but we have some of the same problems in Scotland as well in terms of an inability to actually build the number of houses that are required. as you say, a mismatch between supply and demand, and we have politicians who focus on the demand aspect of things, particularly here in Scotland, where the government is in favour of introducing rent controls, which will exacerbate housing difficulties across the market. And then in England, this notion that abolishing stamp duty for first-time buyers up to £425,000, that's a gift to the people selling houses. It doesn't actually deliver any benefit to the people who are trying to purchase them, because prices go up to compensate for this. And you're absolutely right that the Help to Buy schemes have only served to support asset prices. And so, all of this is sort of retreading stuff as well. It's all versions of stuff the Conservatives have done before, and where it isn't that, it is the Conservatives trying to undo or correct some of their previous decisions. And that, again, reinforces, I think, the core story of this campaign, which is that the Conservatives have run out of time, run out of energy, run out of imagination, run out of ideas. And therefore, by default, it is time for change. And
on this theme of retreading previous announcements and positions and all the rest of it. Now, you are seated, and I don't want you to fall off your seat. I don't want you to start laughing. I don't want you to guffaw. The Conservatives are going to cut immigration. That's what they say. A legal limit to migration. You believe them?
No. I mean, why would anyone believe them? And here again, you're making a promise that nobody who actually has immigration as one of their top 2 or 3 concerns is going to believe. And you are thereby actually reinforcing, from their perspective, for the people who have these concerns, you are reinforcing your previous failure, at least as they see it. Now, I think you could argue that it isn't actually a failure, and that there are lots of reasons why immigration has been good for the United Kingdom, and the shift in immigration policy post-Brexit, from immigration from the European Union to immigration from the rest of the world and so on, is actually a demonstration of what you can do with Brexit, because the point of taking back control wasn't necessarily to do things differently. It was to have the ability to do things differently if you want it. And I think you could make an argument that immigration has been a demonstration of that, even if, clearly it does place certain amounts of pressure on public services and housing and other matters in particular parts of the country, not so much in Scotland, again, because one of our difficulties here is actually attracting immigration from other parts of the world. But, again, the more the Tories talk about immigration, the more they remind the voters who are concerned about immigration that the Tories have failed and broken all their past promises on the subject. So it doesn't strike me as a vote-winning strategy for them.
I think there's a number of problems with this policy in terms of just saying we're going to set a cap, or we're going to set a cap on certain visa categories, and once we reach the cap, that is it. Now, this Rwanda policy has been bogged down in the courts and could continue to be bogged down in the courts. I could also see this kind of policy to be bogged down in the courts. Why? Well, for example, British citizens who marry foreign partners and who have children, there is no automatic right of the foreign partner and the children to come here. They have to come through a series of family visas for which they pay pretty high visa fees. The sponsoring British partner has to earn a certain amount of money, and that's all due to go up. If you get to a situation where they say, right, we're going to let X thousand in under the family route. This is British citizens who have foreign spouses and children, and they want to settle here. Sorry, you can't bring your husband or your wife or one child or 2 children. We've run out of visas for this year. We've already got to the cap. That is absolutely, in my view, a love tax, unambiguously, in my view, a breach of the European Convention and the right to family life, and the application of that kind of regime would be struck down, in my view, by the courts. But the other issue, of course, is that if you simply say we're only going to allow so many students to come here and study, you're creating quite a problem economically for the operation of British educational institutions, for their income, and for their abilities to cross-subsidise the fact that in Scotland there's free tuition. There's a whole, this is all the law of unintended consequences. And it just strikes me that this is yet another policy designed to get a headline. And when you actually start looking at some of the details of it, they will probably fall foul of legal challenge, if not a backlash, on the basis that the operation of this, frankly, as it relates to family visas, is actually inhumane.
Yeah, and absolutely. I agree with that. And, we also, again, have the ironic situation where the Conservative Party is deploring and condemning certain things that are actually a great British success story. And the university sector is one such area, where, there's going to be a real problem with university funding anyway. Because if you think, in England, okay, there are tuition fees, but they've been frozen for more than a decade. So in real terms, universities are not getting anything like the same amount of income they once had, which then, of course, means that they are more and more dependent on overseas students to, as you say, cross-subsidize the domestic students, if you like. And in Scotland, that plays out with a thing whereby, particularly the ancient universities have an incentive to attract as many students as they can from England and ideally from further afield. And the Scottish government, in return for not levying tuition fees, caps the number of student places it is prepared to fund, which then disadvantages quite a number of Scottish students or would-be students. But, again, even on immigration, I think there is a story that can be told of global Britain, if you like, which was, what Brexit was to be marketed as, that is open to the rest of the world, open to the rest, to people coming from India, from Nigeria, from wherever, that makes a virtue out of the number of Ukrainians who've been hosted in the United Kingdom in the last couple of years, that points out that, we've welcomed about 180,000 people fleeing Chinese persecution in Hong Kong into the UK, that this is a Britain that is open to the world, exactly as advertised by Brexit and so on. But that's not the story the Conservative Party wants to tell. Instead, it's actually got to the stage where it is ashamed of its own successes, ashamed of its own liberalism in certain respects. And that, again, is just not a place from which you can win an election.
Well, let's move on to our third issue, which is the Euros, which are starting on Friday. First game is Germany against Scotland, so we'll all sit with fingers crossed, and absolutely more in hope than expectation, since some of the friendlies in the run-up to the tournament haven't been particularly great. Now, our producer, as you know, Alex, is particularly exercised about the alleged causal link between sporting performance, turnout in election, and support for the party which has patriotism at its heart. Now, I think all of this is pretty much baloney. What's your own take?
Well, yes. I'm afraid I'm rather agreeing with you again, Bernard. I think that there is no universe in which, England, for example, winning the European Championships or being on in the latter stages of it really benefits the incumbent government. There are various academic studies that suggest, that sporting success at major international competitions we have a 1% uplift for the incumbent party. But I think that, that this is shugly science at best. And, in this context, really, who... when you have an election that people know the outcome, where the governing party admits it's on course for a terrible defeat and so on, the notion that Jude Bellingham and Harry Kane can rescue Rishi Sunak, I think, strikes me as something that's quite hard to believe in. And from a Scottish point of view, again, everybody's happy to be at the party, but the likelihood is that, Scotland will be home before the postal votes. That's not something that is likely, I think, to feed into support for the SNP or give anyone reason to vote against the SNP or to stay at home. There's often stuff about. You'll remember the fiasco of Argentina '78, Bernard.
I will.
Better than I do.
I do. Look, we're hurting the producer's feelings. It's only
Well,
he's. Have you got the text? This is deeply unfair. I argued that marginal issues in an election with marginal seats has an effect. Whether turnout, boosted national is just one. Okay, okay, okay. I hear you. I feel your pain. But you mentioned Argentina 78. I do indeed remember it. I remember the event. Faith, Hope and Calamity was actually an STV series at which they spent a lot of time going over the issue about the linkage between Argentina and the devolution referendum on the 1st of March 1979. And indeed, you had people like Margaret MacDonald and Jim Sillars, who were all wheeled out to tell us with all of the authority at their muster that this was not good in terms of a yes vote in 79. We all know what the issue in 79 was. It was George Cunningham's amendment, the 40% rule, and the gerrymandering of the referendum. That's what the issue was in 79. And did anybody seriously, when they were being vox-popped by the broadcasters, coming out of the polling stations on the 1st of March 1979, how did you vote? I voted no. Why did you vote no? Oh, see when that equaliser went in for Iran and poor Ali MacLeod put his head in his hands. I just thought at that point, no, there's no way we could vote for an assembly. It's all rubbish. It's all complete rubbish. And you know what? It's sort of, I think that it's an insulting observation to the voters. I think the voters are mature enough to know what they vote for, why they want to vote for something without being influenced by any noise in the background, whether it's calamitous or joyous.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, but then there is an SNP sort of trope that, over many years and so on. It was Jim Sillars who condemned what he termed, 90-minute patriots. The problem with Scots is that we're not sufficiently patriotic and so on, and that it's only on the football field or for some the rugby field and so on where people are properly patriotic.
I think the quote was in 1992. The 90-minute patriots was from an STV interview. Done by Rob Brown, a journalist whose name you might be familiar with from the past. And Jim said, after he lost his seat in Govan, the problem is that in Murrayfield or Hampden, they'll sing Flower of Scotland, but when it comes to the issue of the self-determination of their own country, they're only 90-minute patriots. But he's not leaving it alone as our producer. He's really not. He's at it again. really, what we're going to have to do is invite him on as a guest if he feels he's saying France '98 Chirac boost after the World Cup. Okay, I'll give him that.
Well, but in the first place, Scotland are not going to win the European Championships, and although England could, again, we come back to the thing that's a gift for Keir Starmer. It's the kind of thing that if England do win the tournament, and they obviously have a team that has a chance of doing so, then that will give the new government a lift, because you will have an awful lot of people in England who are joyously happy, and it will allow Starmer to say, a new dawn has broken, has it not? Echoes of Tony Blair, and that aspect of things, the notion that that change is possible. Both on the football field and in Downing Street will be reinforced by English success. But the effect of that will be short-term and ephemeral. What is going to dictate Keir Starmer's success in government is the state of the economy first and foremost, and then the revenues that are available as a result of that to spend on public services and a whole host of other issues. And Harry Kane, Sir Harry Kane, if England win, or Lord Kane perhaps, is neither here nor there.
Amen to that. And I think with that, we'll draw a close on today's proceedings. Remember, do get in touch. Ponsonby and Massie at gmail.com. And I think the Twitter it's Ponsonby and Massie, isn't it, on Twitter?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for being with us and for listening.
And we have had one or two people getting in touch since last time, including Eileen Reid. And Eileen Reid is the daughter of the great UCS hero Jimmy Reid. it was really swapping stories about what happens on the hustings. And Eileen says, my gran, Emily Swankie, was a Communist Party candidate some election in Clydebank in the 1970s. One constituent yelled from a third-floor tenement, I'm no voting communist, so I threw your leaflet in the fire. Mrs. Swankie yelled back, I'd throw you in after it, but shite doesn't burn. She says, those were the days. Keep your stories of the election campaign coming. If they're good, if they're funny, we'll read them out. But until next time, it's good night from him.
And it's good night from him.